Story number 1. The Ghosts of St. John's Church. I'd never thought much about ghosts before. Sure, I'd heard the stories, the old wives' tales you pick up as a kid. The ones that make you laugh nervously but never truly believe. You know, the ones, haunted houses, restless spirits, things that go bump in the night. I was an adult now, and I like to think I'd left those superstitions behind. But that was before St. John's. St. John's Church in Kansas wasn't special. At least, not in the way that you'd think. It was just a small, empty building now, tucked away on the outskirts of town, its spire rising above the rest of the forgotten buildings. It had been a grand place, once, a place of worship, of community, but the congregation had dwindled over the years, and by the time I'd heard about it, the last parishioners had left, and the church stood empty, abandoned, and decaying. Some said it was the wind, that it made the old building creak and groan in the night. Others claimed it was the ghosts of the old parishioners, those who had prayed in the pews and died in the town, that haunted it now. I didn't buy it, not at first. It was a cold October evening when I decided to investigate the church. A group of friends had suggested it. A small team of urban explorers, always seeking the eerie, the unexplained. We'd been inside old factories, long-abandoned houses, and derelict hospitals. But St. John's, well, St. John's had its own reputation. People talked about the place as though it had a personality, a living, breathing thing that didn't want anyone intruding. But we were curious. And curiosity, well, curiosity always gets the better of you. There were 5 of us: Eli, Sam, Jessica, Mark, and me, of course. We'd been planning it for weeks, researching the history of the church, and what we found only made it more enticing. The rumors were strange, odd even. People said that they'd seen the paintings in the church shift, that doors opened on their own, that whispers filled the air where no one was supposed to be. We met at dusk, the sky painted in dusky purples and fiery oranges. The wind was biting, sharp as it whipped through the trees, and the town seemed smaller. Somehow, as we drove away from it, we reached the church around 7. It stood before us, a hulking silhouette against the horizon, its stone walls crumbling, the stained glass windows shattered, yet somehow still intact enough to feel ominous. The doors were wide open, inviting us in. I suppose we should have turned around then. Something about that openness, like it was waiting for us. But we didn't. "Let's get this over with," Sam said, already stepping into the dark interior. Eli led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The smell hit us first, musty, stale, like death itself had settled into the very bones of the building. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. The pews lined up like forgotten sentinels. The air inside felt heavy, too heavy, like it was holding something back, something waiting. We set up our equipment, cameras, voice recorders, and, of course, our flashlights. We moved quietly through the aisles, every step echoing in the vast, empty space. There was no sound of life here, not even the creak of the old floorboards beneath our feet. It didn't take long before things started to happen. First, it was the paintings, the ones that hung high above the altar, religious icons. Depictions of saints and angels started to shift. I thought at first it was just the way the light hit them, but then it happened again. Painting of Christ, his face contorted in agony, slowly tilted. Then, just as slowly, it righted itself. "Did anyone see that?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all looked up. The painting was normal again, as if nothing had happened. "Just the wind," Eli said, though I could see his jaw tight, his nerves a little more on edge. We continued deeper into the church, moving toward the altar. As we approached, I felt the temperature drop, the cold creeping down my spine like icy fingers. It wasn't natural. It wasn't just the chill of the building. It felt like something else, something more ancient and unsettling. "Do you hear that?" Mark asked. His voice was tight, strained. At first, I didn't, but then I did, a soft shuffling sound. like footsteps moving in the distance. We all stopped, freezing, listening. The footsteps came closer, then stopped. "Who's messing around?" Sam asked, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "I'm not messing around," Jessica said, looking just as freaked out. "I swear, I heard it too." We all looked at each other, a bit of uncertainty creeping into our group. There was no one else here. We had all seen the doors were wide open when we arrived. But the footsteps, they were undeniable. Someone or something was walking inside the church. I felt the urge to leave. I don't know why. It was an instinct, deep in my gut, a primal urge to run and never look back. But I forced myself to stay, to keep moving forward. We reached the altar. That's when it happened. The door at the far side of the room, one that led to the basement, I think creaked open, slowly. No wind, no draft, just the sound of old wood on old hinges. Then, as if on cue, we all heard it, the low hum of a whisper, soft and indistinguishable at first, but then, louder, more clear. "Leave!" I froze, and that's when I saw it there, standing by the altar, just inside the shadows. A figure, a man, or something like a man. His features were indistinct, a shadow that didn't quite belong. He was tall, his silhouette sharp against the faint light from the broken windows. But it wasn't his size or shape that made my stomach churn. It was the fact that I couldn't see his face. I don't know how long I stared at him, but when I blinked, he was gone. Mark screamed. Something invisible hit him, hard. It sent him stumbling backward, falling to the floor. He cried out in pain, clutching his chest as though something had pushed the air from his lungs. We rushed to him, helping him up, but the air felt heavier now, thicker, as if it were pressing down on us. "Get out of here," Sam hissed, his voice full of terror. "We need to go. Now." We didn't need to be told twice. We ran for the doors, but they slammed shut before we could reach them. My heart thudded in my chest as I tried the handle. Locked. Something or someone had locked us inside. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, the doors flew open. We spilled out into the cold night air, panting and gasping, as if the very act of leaving had stolen every last bit of breath from our lungs. None of us said a word, but as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the church was watching us, waiting. Those footsteps, those whispers, they would never stop. St. John's had claimed its victims, and it would always claim more. I haven't been back, and I don't think I ever will. If you ever find yourself near St. John's Church, if you ever hear the whispers, or see the paintings move, or feel the chill in the air, don't go in. Don't even think about it. Because once you've crossed that threshold, once you've felt the presence of the old parishioners, the ghosts that haunt those walls, there's no coming back. You'll hear their footsteps behind you. You'll feel their breath on the back of your neck. And worse, when you leave, they might just follow you. Story number 2. The woman in the Sacred Heart Church. I wasn't supposed to be there. None of us were. But we were young, foolish, and a little too brave for our own good. That's what happens when you're in your 20s. I guess you think you're invincible. It's only when you've crossed the line, when you've stepped into a place that's better left alone, that you start to realize just how fragile that feeling is. And let me tell you, Sacred Heart Church in Michigan was one of those places. It had been abandoned for decades, a relic of the 19th century. The church stood like a sentinel in the heart of the small, dying town of St. Joseph. The locals never spoke about it much, at least, not openly, but I had heard the whispers. They said the place was cursed. They said that on certain nights, if you were brave or foolish enough to wander inside, you'd see her, the woman. She was always dressed in the dark, somber colors of the 1800s, her long black gown trailing behind her as she walked the empty pews. Sometimes she was seen standing by the front doors, her pale face just visible in the moonlight, and her eyes, those eyes. People said they could feel her gaze even when they were far from the church. I never believed it, of course, not until that night. It all started with a dare. There were 4 of us, me, Mark, Kelly, and Susan, who decided we were going to spend the night in Sacred Heart. We had no real reason to go. We weren't the type to chase ghosts, but there was something about the church that called to us. And like I said, we were young. We had no idea what we were getting into. We arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The church sat on a hill, its Gothic spires jutting up into the darkening sky like a jagged hand reaching toward the heavens. Its stone facade was covered in ivy, the windows dark and lifeless. It looked like something from a different time, place out of place, frozen in an age long gone. "Well, here we are," Mark said, cracking his knuckles. He was always the tough guy, the one who led the charge. "I'm sure it's all just a bunch of crap. Let's go see what all the fuss is about." We climbed the stone steps to the entrance, the heavy wooden doors standing before us like the mouth of some ancient beast. I remember feeling that twinge of unease in my stomach as I reached for the door. There was no reason for it. Really, just the weight of the building, the history, the stories that had followed it for years. The door creaked open with a groan, the sound echoing through the empty church. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay, old wood, mold, and something else, something musty, something that didn't belong in a place of worship. We stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't like the kind of quiet you get when you're alone in a big room. No, this was a heavy silence, the kind that presses on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The floor was covered in dust and debris, the pews cracked and decaying, their varnish peeling away like dead skin. The altar stood at the front, untouched by time, but there was something about it, something about the way the shadows moved around it, that made my heart race. "All right, let's take a look around," Kelly said, shining her flashlight on the walls. "Nothing to be afraid of, right?" I agreed, but there was an undeniable sense of foreboding that hung in the air, like we were intruders in some ancient ritual. As we moved deeper into the church, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't long before we saw her. She was standing at the entrance, just beyond the heavy wooden doors. Her figure was tall and thin, draped in a black gown that flowed around her feet like water. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, her long dark hair framing it like a veil. Her eyes, though, her eyes were the worst part. They weren't just eyes, they were dark, empty pits that seemed to suck in all the light around them. And when she looked at us, I felt it. A cold shiver ran down my spine, a sensation like being pulled into a void. For a moment, none of us moved. I don't know if we were too afraid to speak, or if we just couldn't believe what we were seeing. But she stood there, watching us, her expression unreadable. "What the hell?" Susan whispered, her voice shaking. "Did anyone else see that?" Mark asked, his voice strained. I nodded slowly, though I didn't know why I was nodding. I felt like I was frozen, like my legs couldn't move. Then, without a sound, the figure began to fade, slowly melting into the shadows. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, she was gone. "Did she just vanish?" Kelly asked, her voice thin with disbelief. I turned to her, my mouth dry, but before I could answer, a soft, almost inaudible sound echoed through the church. A whisper, a sigh. It was as if the very walls of Sacred Heart were speaking to us, breathing in time with us. My heart raced. "I don't like this," Susan said, her voice trembling now. "Let's go. Let's just leave." But it wasn't that easy. As we turned to head back toward the door, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement, just at the edge of my vision. And then, just like before, she appeared again, standing by the altar this time, her back to us, her head tilted slightly, as if waiting. This time, I could feel the temperature drop sharp, like ice spreading through my veins. The air around us seemed to grow thicker, heavier. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling as I tried to open it. But it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but it felt as though the door was sealed shut from the outside, as if something, no, Someone was holding it closed. "Help me!" I cried. But the words felt weak in my throat. And then, in a voice like the wind through broken glass, I heard her speak. "Leave. Now." It was so soft, so quiet, that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. But then the room began to pulse. The walls pressing in, the shadows thickening like they were alive. We ran. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air, the door slamming shut behind us. The wind whipped around us, carrying with it the distant sound of someone screaming, wailing. It was her voice. We didn't look back. None of us did. We never spoke about that night again. But I know what I saw. I know what we all saw. We had disturbed something in Sacred Heart Church that should have been left alone. To this day, I hear her voice in the quiet moments of the night. It comes, soft and pleading, just like it did in that church. It's not a call for help. It's a warning. She's still there, in the church, watching, waiting. And if you're ever foolish enough to go inside, she'll be waiting for you, too. Story number 3. The Wail of All Saints Church. I never believed in ghosts. At least, I didn't believe in them until that night. The night I visited All Saints Church in Wisconsin. I was part of a small group of tourists who had heard the stories about the abandoned church on the outskirts of town. Rumors had floated around for years about strange occurrences, disembodied voices, ghostly figures, and eerie sounds echoing from within its crumbling walls. Most people laughed it off, dismissed it as urban legend, a ghost story to tell around a campfire. But me, I was a skeptic. I thought if I went in, I'd be the one to debunk the tales and put them to rest once and for all. Boy, was I wrong. It was winter when we arrived. The night cold and sharp. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones and refuses to leave. The wind howled outside, a steady shriek that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. The church sat in the distance, a hulking silhouette against the dark sky, its Gothic spires reaching upward like hands clawing for the heavens. The paint had long since peeled off, revealing raw wood and stone beneath. And the windows, those once beautiful stained glass windows, were shattered, leaving gaping holes that allowed the wind to whip through. There were 5 of us that night. 4 others besides me. We were all in our 20s, young, reckless, and full of that unearned confidence that comes with youth. We had cameras, flashlights, and a sense of adventure that would soon be replaced by pure terror. We crossed the threshold, pushing open the creaking door. The musty air hit us immediately, thick and damp, like the church had been holding its breath for years. The floorboards groaned beneath our feet as we moved deeper into the building. The faint smell of mildew and old wood clinging to everything. "Look at this place," Laura whispered, shining her flashlight across the room. Her voice echoed in the silence, but something about the way it bounced off the walls felt wrong, too sharp. We wandered through the nave, the long, empty space stretching before us. The pews were still in place, though cracked and broken, some of them overturned as if someone had abandoned the place in a hurry. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Maybe it was just the darkness, or the loneliness of the building, but I felt it, deep in my gut, the unsettling sensation that we didn't belong here. That's when we first heard it. A soft, low sound, almost like a groan. It was so faint at first that I thought I imagined it. But then it came again. A long, drawn-out rattle, like someone was trying to speak but couldn't quite manage the words. We all stopped in our tracks, turning toward the sound. "Did you hear that?" Greg asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Laura said, her flashlight trembling slightly as she swung it around. "What the hell is that?" We all listened intently. Came again, louder this time. Closer. It was coming from upstairs. "I'm gonna go check it out," Greg said, his bravado taking over. "You guys wait here. Don't be an idiot," I warned. But he was already halfway up the creaky stairs. Reluctantly, the rest of us followed. But there was something in the air now, a heaviness, as if we had entered a place that wasn't quite part of our world anymore. We crept through the narrow, dimly lit corridor on the upper floor, the groaning sound growing louder with every step. It was like something or someone was in pain, a suffering, endless moan. Each breath labored, felt wrong. It felt like the sound of a soul trapped in agony. "Where is it coming from?" Laura asked, her voice trembling now. We searched the upstairs in vain. The sound stopped the moment we reached the front of the church, and we stood in stunned silence, each of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. The air was thick with something intangible, like we were being watched from the shadows, but we could see nothing. "We should go," I said, my voice breaking through the tension. "This place gives me the creeps." Just as we turned to leave, there was another noise, this one louder. A sharp, shrill cry, a scream that sent chills down my spine, came from the basement. I didn't want to go down there. No part of me wanted to venture into that dark pit. But I wasn't about to be the first one to chicken out. So, we descended, one by one, the staircase creaking under our weight as we made our way into the bowels of the church. The basement was colder, darker, and it reeked of rot. The floor was wet, and I could hear the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. We moved forward cautiously, the sound of our footsteps muted in the heavy air. And then came again, the rattle, the groan, the unmistakable sound of a voice. But this time, it wasn't just a voice. This time, it was calling us. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. I thought I was hearing things. But no, it was there, clear as day, a whispering, calling our names, one by one. Greg, Laura, Eddie. My name came last, but it was no less chilling. I could feel the air grow colder around me, feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Get out of here," I whispered to the others, but they were frozen, wide-eyed, staring at the shadows in the corner of the basement. And then, I saw it. A figure, no. A shape emerged from the darkness. It was humanoid, but wrong. It didn't have the shape of a person. Not really. It was a twisted, shifting thing, like a blur of motion and shadow. It was hunched, its limbs too long, its face a blur of features that flickered in and out like a broken television screen. And as it moved closer, the sound grew louder, the gasps, the rattle, the cries. I didn't wait for it to come any closer. I grabbed Laura's arm, pulling her toward the stairs. Greg and Eddie followed, and we scrambled up the stairs like animals, desperate to escape whatever was behind us. But no matter how fast we ran, the sound followed us, echoing through the church, through the corridors, through the very walls themselves. We didn't stop until we were outside, panting, gasping for breath. The cold night air hit us like a slap, and I could still hear it, the sound, the cry, the names being whispered. It was too much. The thought of going back inside, of confronting whatever had followed us, was unbearable. But I knew we had to leave. None of us said a word as we climbed into the car. None of us looking back at the church. We never spoke of that night again. But I could see it in their eyes. The same look I knew was in mine. The same terror. The same realization. We had disturbed something that should have been left alone. And still, to this day, when the wind blows cold through the trees, I hear it, the wail, the whispering call. It isn't far. It's just outside the window, just beyond reach. And it's calling me. It's calling all of us. Story number 4. The Ghost of St. Mary's Church. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. I mean, I've heard all the stories, all the whispers, and seen all the films. But they were just that, stories, right? That's what I told myself. Anyway, I was young, full of bravado, thinking I was untouchable. But that night changed everything. It was a cold fall evening in Pennsylvania, the kind of night where the wind cuts through you like a blade, and the air smells like damp leaves and forgotten memories. My friends and I had been talking about St. Mary's Church for weeks. The old place had been abandoned since the 1970s, long before any of us were born. We all heard the rumors, that it was haunted by the ghost of a priest who had died there under mysterious circumstances, that it was a place where time itself seemed to stand still, trapping those who dared enter. Most of the stories were exaggerated, but they kept us curious. And curiosity was a dangerous thing when you were young. That night, we gathered at the edge of the woods, where the crumbling stone walls of St. Mary's stood like a forgotten monument to a time long past. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a sickly light over the decaying structure. The church loomed in the distance, its windows dark and empty, like eyes that had long since lost the ability to see. We were here to explore, to prove that we weren't afraid. As we crept toward the church, the wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves around our feet. A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't let it show. I could hear my friends' voices ahead of me, their laughter carrying in the still air. We were all nervous, but none of us wanted to admit it. Not yet. We pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for a building that had been abandoned for so long. The smell of mold and dust was overpowering. But there was something else in the air, too. Something different. Something I couldn't quite place. The church had once been grand. I was sure of it. The high wooden beams that arched overhead were still intact, though darkened by time and neglect. The stained glass windows, though cracked, still allowed the faintest slivers of moonlight to trickle in, casting strange shadows on the walls. It was eerily beautiful in its decay, but there was an undeniable feeling that something wasn't right. Presence, perhaps. We wandered further into the building, our footsteps echoing off the stone floors. I could hear the whispers of my friends behind me, and I could see the occasional flash of their flashlights, moving like fireflies in the dark. It felt like we were intruding on a place that didn't want us there. But we pressed on, eager to see if the stories were true. As we reached the altar, something strange happened. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I felt a shiver run through my body that had nothing to do with the cold air. I could see my breath misting in front of me, a thin wisp that dissipated quickly. We were standing near the altar now, just a few feet from where the pulpit had once stood. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing by the far window, just inside the shadows where the moonlight couldn't reach. At first, I thought it was one of my friends. Maybe someone had wandered off to get a better look at the stained glass windows. But as I focused, I realized it wasn't any of us. The figure was tall, dressed in the long, flowing robes of a priest. His face was obscured by the darkness, but the shape of his body, the way he stood, rigid, unmoving, was unmistakable. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My legs felt like lead. "Guys," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Look." They didn't hear me at first. They were too busy chatting, poking around, completely unaware of the presence in the corner. But then, one of my friends, Greg, turned and followed my gaze. His face went pale. "Who the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice low but frantic. We all turned to look. The figure was still there, standing by the window, staring into the darkness outside. But now, something was different. The air around him seemed to shimmer, as though he was standing in a heat wave, but it was cold. So cold. The feeling in the room became oppressive, like a weight had settled on my chest. I took a step forward. I didn't know why. Maybe I thought it was just some prank or some trick of the light, but as I stepped closer, the figure shifted. Slowly, deliberately, he turned toward us. That's when the world seemed to freeze. His face, I can't describe it. It wasn't human. Not anymore. It was pale, deathly pale, with eyes that were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to stare into my soul. His mouth was open, but there was no sound, just the faintest whisper, like the wind through the trees. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared, vanished into thin air, like smoke caught in the wind. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest, and for a moment, I wondered if it had all been a trick of my mind. But then I saw the cold, pale breath escape from my own lips, and I knew it wasn't a trick. It was real. We all stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, too terrified to move, too afraid to speak. But then the spell broke. Greg bolted for the door, running like he had never run before. The rest of us followed, scrambling over one another in our panic to escape the church, to get out of that place, away from whatever we had just seen. We didn't look back as we ran through the darkened woods, our hearts hammering in our chests. We didn't stop until we were out in the open, the distant lights of the town flickering in the distance. That night, we all swore we would never go back. And we never did. Not one of us. I tried to tell myself it was just our imaginations, that the dark had played tricks on us. But I know better now. I know what I saw. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I can still hear that priest's voice, faint, but there, calling me back. I don't know if he ever really left. Story number 5. The spirit of the pastor at Grace Church. I never believed in ghosts, at least, not until that night at Grace Church. I was just a security guard, doing my rounds like I had every other night for the past 2 years. A long, lonely shift in a place that had seen better days. The church, once the pride of its neighborhood, had been abandoned for years, ever since the last pastor died in the early 1960s. They say the place was cursed, haunted by the spirit of the old pastor who had lived and died there. But I didn't buy it. Ghosts, spirits, hauntings, all nonsense, right? But then came that night, that winter night. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows of the church, and snow whipped through the empty streets. The city felt silent, cold, almost as if the whole world had stopped for a moment. It was the perfect kind of night for things to happen, the kind of night when your mind starts to play tricks on you. The night was heavy with expectation, the kind of expectant silence that makes every noise seem louder than it really is. I was on the late shift. As usual, the church was locked up tight, dark as a tomb. My job was simple: patrol the building every hour, check that all the doors and windows were secured, make sure the place stayed empty. It was an easy gig, too easy, and, after a while, it became routine. But that night, I felt something shift in the air. I had just passed by the kitchen when I heard it. The sound of someone talking. No, not talking, preaching. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The voice was distant, faint, but unmistakable. It was a man's voice, deep, resonant, carrying that old, familiar cadence of a preacher. It echoed through the empty hallways, like it had always been there, waiting to be heard again. The words were too muffled for me to understand, but there was no mistaking the tone. It was a sermon being preached at the altar. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. The church was closed. There was no one here. I had locked every door myself. The lights were off. The heat was turned down. No one could have gotten in. I took a slow, cautious step forward. The sound was coming from the sanctuary, the main hall. I walked down the narrow corridor, the shadows of the pews stretching long and menacing in the dim light of my flashlight. I could still hear the preacher's voice, clear now, though it seemed to echo and distort as I moved closer. It was almost as if the walls themselves were alive, reverberating with the words of someone long dead. By the time I reached the sanctuary doors, the voice had grown louder. It was no longer muffled, but full and commanding, like a sermon I'd heard 1,000 times in my youth. The church's doors were still locked. I pulled on the handle. It was open. I stepped inside, my flashlight flickering as I entered. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of the streetlights outside, filtering through the stained glass windows. The pews were empty, just rows of cold, lifeless wood. The altar stood in the center of the room, bathed in shadow. There was no one here. The voice should have stopped, but it didn't. Continued, louder now, more urgent, as if it was coming from the very walls, from beneath the floorboards, from everywhere at once. I moved closer, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The closer I got to the altar, the stronger the feeling became, like the air itself was thicker, heavier. And then I saw him. The figure was standing there, in the dim light, at the front of the altar, a man, dressed in the old robes of a pastor. His back was to me, his head slightly bowed, as though he was lost in prayer, lost in the words of a sermon that had never ended. His hands rested on the pulpit, and he seemed so real, so solid, that for a moment, I thought I was imagining it. But the closer I got, the more certain I became. This wasn't a trick of the light, or my mind playing games with me. The figure was real, too real, and then turned. I was frozen in place. The face of the pastor was pale, so pale it looked like it had never seen the light of day. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring at me with an intensity that felt like it was burning right through me. His lips moved, though no sound came out. His mouth opened again, and I could hear it, the voice, the same voice I had heard earlier. "Come closer," it whispered. I took a step back, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. My body refused to listen. The preacher's eyes didn't leave me. He reached out a hand, and that's when I saw it, his fingers, long and twisted, like old, gnarled branches. His skin was stretched thin, stretched too tight, and I could see the veins pulsing under the surface. He was decaying, rotting. His face began to distort, his lips curling in a grotesque smile. But those eyes were still the same. "Don't you want to hear the word?" he said, his voice now echoing in my head. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, an overwhelming force that pressed down on me, suffocating me, filling every corner of my mind. I tried to run. I turned and sprinted for the door, but it was as if the room had stretched, as if the sanctuary itself had grown impossibly large. The exit was just out of reach. The voice followed me, growing louder, pulling me back toward him. "You can't leave," the pastor's voice called out. "I've waited so long. You must stay." I could feel the cold air on my skin, the icy fingers of dread tightening around my throat. Couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. When I finally managed to make it to the door, I turned the handle. But when I opened it, I wasn't outside anymore. I was back in the hallway, the same hallway I had entered from. And the preacher was there too, standing in the doorway, blocking my escape. "You can't leave," he repeated. "You belong here. You belong to me." I didn't wait to hear more. I shoved past him, blindly running through the church, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest like it was going to explode. When I finally stumbled out into the night air, gasping for breath, I didn't look back. I never went back to Grace Church again. The next day, I told the other guards. I told them everything. They laughed it off, said I was tired, that it was just a bad dream. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. And to this day, when I pass by the church, I still hear it, that voice, preaching from within, the sermon that never ended. The ghost of the pastor still lingers there, waiting for someone else to come in and listen, waiting for the next fool to hear the call. And sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever truly be free of it. I wonder if anyone really leaves Grace Church. Story number 6. The Haunted Bells of the Presbyterian Church. I should have known better. I should have listened to the warnings, to the old man down at the corner store who whispered under his breath every time I mentioned the Presbyterian Church in New Orleans. He had said, "Those bells aren't just bells. Boy, they're the sound of souls trapped in the past." I didn't believe him, not at first. How could I? After all, it was just an old church, standing at the edge of the French Quarter, weathered by time, forgotten by the world, a place that people had long since abandoned, and even the ghosts had grown tired of haunting. That was my view. Anyway, skepticism ran deep in my veins, fueled by the knowledge that these kinds of stories were nothing more than local legends, fodder for tourists and thrill-seekers. But then, one stormy night, I found myself standing in front of the Presbyterian Church, with a few friends by my side. We were the kind of group that thrived on adventure, on the unknown. There was something about the atmosphere that night, the low hum of thunder in the distance, the wind howling through the streets of New Orleans, that made everything feel off. It had been abandoned for years. The doors of the church hung open, groaning as if pleading to be left alone. The windows, once beautiful stained glass, were now shattered, the frames warped with the weight of neglect. But it was the bells that had always drawn people's attention. People who lived in the area. People like me, who had heard the rumors. They were the kind of bells that didn't belong to a church anymore. They were the kind of bells that belonged to something older, something darker. And even though no one had tended to the church in years, no one had touched those bells, they still rang on nights like tonight, when the storm rolled in, when the air grew thick and heavy with something other than rain. The group of us, 5 in total, stood at the entrance. The church loomed before us, like a sentient thing, as if it could feel our presence, as if it had been waiting for us all this time. I felt the familiar excitement of a dare, the thrill of what might happen next. It wasn't the first abandoned building I'd explored, nor would it be the last, but this one felt different. The whispers of its past lingered in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "Ready?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but I knew the others could hear the uncertainty creeping in. "We came all this way. Let's do it," Jake said, his voice filled with that cocky bravado that had gotten us into trouble more times than I care to count. With a collective breath, we stepped inside. The interior was just as neglected as the outside. Dust and cobwebs covered the once polished pews, now decaying and rotting with the passage of time. The air smelled stale, like old wood and mildew, and it was colder than I expected. A chill that crawled under my skin. A chill that wasn't from the rain or the wind outside. It was the kind of cold that made you feel watched, made you question whether the walls themselves were alive. We moved deeper into the church, our footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. A sound that seemed too loud, too disruptive for a place so desolate. There was something wrong with the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes with a long-forgotten building. It was the silence of a place that still held memories. Memories that weren't ready to be forgotten. That's when we heard it. A single, distant chime. It rang through the church like a warning. Its sound rolling over us like the weight of 1,000 years of history. But there was no one up in the bell tower. There was no one to pull the rope, to strike the iron. The sound came from nowhere, and yet, it filled the space around us, making the air hum with its presence. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp with fear. "Just the wind," I said, but even I could hear the uncertainty in my own words. The wind couldn't make a bell ring like that, couldn't make it sound like the bell was crying out in the dark. We stood there, waiting, listening. Another chime, louder this time, and then another. The bells rang in perfect, unsettling intervals, their sound growing more insistent, as if they were calling us. They didn't belong to the church anymore. I realized they belonged to something else, something that had been here long before the church was built. We weren't alone. Not anymore. "Let's get out of here," Jake muttered, but it was too late. The air grew colder still, and we could hear it now, the faint sound of footsteps. Not our own. These steps were heavier, slower, dragging like they were coming from the very floorboards beneath us. They grew louder, closer, and I turned to see if anyone else had heard it. But when I looked, I saw nothing but shadows. The sound of the bells stopped abruptly, replaced by the unmistakable creak of wood on wood. Like something was shifting, something was moving within the church. I looked up to the bell tower, half expecting to see something up there, but the windows were dark. The bell rope swung gently in the still air, but there was no one there to pull it. "Guys, we need to leave, right now," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I turned to look at my friends, but they weren't paying attention anymore. They were staring toward the altar, their eyes wide with terror, and that's when I saw it. The figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and shrouded in darkness. It stood motionless, halfway down the center aisle, staring at us with eyes that I couldn't see but that I could feel. The air grew thick with the presence of it, a weight that pressed down on my chest and made it harder to breathe. The footsteps continued, now accompanied by the sound of dragging chains, the sound of something heavy scraping along the stone floor. "Move!" I shouted, but no one moved. We were paralyzed by fear, by the cold, by the pressure that seemed to be squeezing us from every direction. The figure took a step forward, and the bells rang again, louder this time, their tolls like the roar of a storm breaking the silence. The sound filled the church, vibrating through the walls, through our bones, through our minds. The footsteps grew louder, closer. It was coming toward us, and we couldn't escape. I turned to run, but the doors we had entered through were gone. The entrance had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of stone. There was no way out. The bells rang one last time, a final, deafening chime, and everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I woke up, I was outside the church, lying in the mud. My friends scattered around me like they'd been thrown there. We didn't speak as we stumbled to our feet. None of us said a word about what had happened. We didn't need to. The terror was written on our faces, in the way our hands shook, in the way our eyes darted around, expecting to see something watching us from the shadows. We never went back. No one in New Orleans dared to. The Presbyterian church stood empty, but it wasn't abandoned. It was waiting for the next group of fools to wander in and hear its bells, to hear its whispers, to feel the cold. And when they did, when they finally listened too closely, they'd know the truth. Some places don't stay forgotten. Some things don't stay buried. And the Presbyterian Church in New Orleans? It never lets anyone forget. Story number 7. The Whispers of St. Augustine's Church. The sun was setting behind the ancient buildings of St. Augustine, casting long shadows that stretched across the cobbled streets of Florida's oldest city. The air was thick with salt and the faint smell of the ocean. But it was the chill that struck them first, an unnatural cold that seemed to seep out from the very earth itself. "We should have stayed in the hotel," Laura whispered, pulling her coat tighter as the wind picked up. Her companions, David, Ben, and Sarah, laughed nervously. The old St. Augustine's church loomed ahead of them, its stone walls darkening against the twilight sky. Its towering spires seemed to reach for something beyond the stars, as if calling out to them. The church had been abandoned for decades, closed to the public after the last congregation had left in the late 20th century. Yet it had become a curious landmark, a place that drew tourists with its eerie reputation. "There's nothing to be afraid of," David said, nudging her playfully as he pushed open the creaking wooden door. "Just an old, abandoned building." Laura didn't respond. She had always been drawn to the strange and the unexplained. But there was something about this place that made her skin crawl. The group stepped inside, and immediately, they felt the temperature drop. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of history, and silent. The only sound was the occasional creak of the building settling into the night. They stood for a moment, taking in the sight, rows of empty pews stretching before them, the altar shrouded in shadow, the stained glass windows, long abandoned and cracked, let in just enough light to cast warped, eerie patterns on the stone floor. "I don't like this," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It's just a church," Ben replied dismissively, his voice echoing unervingly through the cavernous space. "It's probably just, well, old and dusty." Laura felt her breath catch. There was something in the air that felt wrong. The kind of wrong you couldn't explain but instinctively understood. They began to explore, their footsteps reverberating loudly in the silence. The musty smell of decay hung in the air, mingling with the faint scent of something sweet, almost like incense. The further they ventured into the church, the colder it became, until even their breath began to fog in the air. "Did you hear that?" David asked, stopping abruptly. At first, Laura thought it was just the wind, but then she heard it too, a faint, almost imperceptible whispering, as though voices were drifting through the walls themselves. Low, murmuring voices that seemed to come from every corner of the church. Sarah looked pale. It's coming from over there. She pointed to a dark corner near the altar, where the shadows seemed to gather unnaturally thick. Stop messing around, Ben said, though there was a nervous edge to his voice now. There's no one here. It's just the wind. Maybe the pipes. But Laura could tell from the look on Sarah's face that it was not the wind. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. Not words, exactly, but phrases that curled through the air. Faint and haunting. It was like hearing a conversation through a thick door, muffled and indistinct, but with a weight to it, a weight that pressed down on them, as if trying to suffocate them. David, determined to dismiss the fear creeping into his mind, stepped forward, moving toward the altar. I'll go check it out. David, don't, Laura called after him, but her voice was drowned by the increasing volume of the whispers. He reached the altar and turned back to face the group, grinning. See? It's nothing. A sudden crash of footsteps, too loud to ignore, echoed from behind him. Laura's heart stopped. She watched, frozen in place, as David's grin faded. His eyes widened in terror. Who's there? He shouted, his voice shaking. The others rushed forward, but before they could reach him, David staggered back, his face pale, eyes wide with something far worse than fear. Get out, he gasped, his voice a hoarse whisper, his fingers pointing toward the door, trembling. There's someone here. I saw. He broke off as the whispering grew louder, now a full chorus of voices, rising from the shadows like a hymn of despair. But it wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from the very walls of the church. The walls themselves seemed to hum with an ancient, unseen energy. Laura looked to the others. We need to leave. Now. But it was too late. The doors that had once seemed like an exit, a promise of safety, were now locked tight. The handles frozen as though held in place by invisible hands. The temperature plummeted again, a biting cold that wrapped around their bones. And then, from the darkened corner of the altar, a figure appeared. It was a shadow at first, a flickering distortion in the dim light. It was tall, gaunt, his face obscured, but the shape was unmistakable. A man, or something like a man, but not quite. His hands were outstretched, fingers curled as if reaching for something they could never hold. Laura felt her heart race. This wasn't just a trick of the light. This wasn't some homeless person who had wandered in, lost to the cold. No, this was something far older, far darker. This was a presence that had been waiting. David was the first to scream. It was a sound that shattered the stillness, piercing the air like a knife. The shadowed figure moved toward them, the slow, deliberate steps dragging through the dust, as if it had all the time in the world. The voices rose to a crescendo, a chorus of whispers that filled the space, pressing in on them, suffocating them. It was as if the very walls of St. Augustine's church were alive, breathing with the spirits of the long dead. Help! Sarah shouted, her voice broken and desperate. But there was no answer, only the endless murmuring of the shadows. The figure reached the center of the room and stopped. For a moment, it just stood there, this hollow, faceless gaze fixed on them. And then, with a sound that was both a whisper and a scream, it lunged forward, vanishing into the shadows before them. The group screamed and rushed for the door, but the heavy wooden beams of the church slammed shut with an unnatural force, trapping them inside. The last thing Laura heard, before the darkness overtook them, was the whispers, a single phrase, clear as day, ringing through the cold air. You shouldn't have come. The next morning, the authorities found St. Augustine's church empty, save for the faint traces of snow beneath the door, and the oppressive silence that lingered in the air. No sign of the group was ever found again, but the church remained, empty, abandoned, and still haunted. The whispers never stopped.